Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out my updated Bear Druid class guide for Shadowlands Patch 9.1. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. We're making an effort to respond to everybody who has a question. Before I get into the meat of the video, be sure to like and subscribe. This is YouTube after all. And I had intended to make some sort of a tier list video before the patch came along, but I don't think there's going to be time for that now. So I'll just say that Bear Druid and Vengeance Demon Hunter were definitely going to be at the top of whatever tier list I came up with. What order they were going to be in, I'm not sure, but there you go. Bear Druid, just as a preview, super tanky, super versatile, has good group utility. The only real downside I can say about it is that it doesn't have some sort of 5% damage increase buff for, magic or physical damage or attack power or whatever. It doesn't have some component of the debuff matrix, but otherwise, it's pretty much a flawless tank. Alright, let's get into it. We'll start by going over the list of class changes to Druids in patch 9.1 that affect Guardian, and it's pretty quick. The Endurance Conduit Well-Honed Instincts has had its cooldown increased by 50% at all ranks. Basically, at the Mythic Castle Nathria item level of 226, this adds about 28 seconds to its cooldown. At the Heroic Sanctum of Domination item level, it's about 26 seconds. So, between 25 and 30 seconds to that cooldown. It's a decent-sized nerf, but frankly, this is still a must-have conduit and a terrific defensive bonus. The only other nerf that occurred, I don't have it written down here, but the passive that granted Guardian Druids 10% damage reduction at all times was changed to only function while you're in bear form. So, if you're tanking in cat form, which you shouldn't do, but sometimes you do, you'll take 10% more damage. So, whatever. There are some other things that have been added in the patch, but they're more system-wide changes that affect all of the classes more or less evenly. Basically, it's new Soulbinds, Conduits, Legendaries, and so on, and I'll get into more detail in each of those respective sections. Okay, let's get to the important stuff, starting with Covenants. The best Covenant for Druids is Night Fae. This is one of the few situations in Shadowlands where choosing the aesthetically best option is also the best gameplay option, and I love it. Being a Night Fae Druid is terrific. For Bear specifically, all of the Heart of the Wild off-spec affinity Convoke the Spirits casts are incredible. You can do a humongous burst of raid healing as Resto affinity. You can do incredible burst AoE damage as Moonkin affinity, balance affinity, or you can do a really, really big burst of single target damage as feral affinity. They're all terrific. The only Convoke that isn't terrific for Bear Druids is the Bear form Convoke. And it's not horrendous. I've used it a handful of times in Mythic Plus dungeons where I couldn't kite to use a Moonkin form Convoke, or back when I was still really undergeared and playing like Resto affinity and I needed an extra defensive cooldown. Bear form Convoke worked okay there. It adds a lot of defensive value. It'll give you a ton of Iron First stacks really quickly. That's cool, but a huge burst of tankiness is rarely ever as good as a huge burst of damage. And just to acknowledge that the other Covenants exist, they do. They're actually pretty good. Vinthyr in particular lines up perfectly with Berserk and Incarnation's cooldown. It can give you the highest overall bear form DPS in AoE. That's not nearly as valuable as what you can do in a balanced Heart of the Wild Convoke, but if you're just trying to be very, very tanky in a Mythic Plus, it's pretty good, and there's something cool about that. Anyhow, that's about it. Go Night Fae. It looks good, it plays good, it feels good, it's the best. Number one. Since we are Night Fae, we're going to go with what I consider the best Soulbind in the entire game, Naya. The left side of her patch 9.0 tree is pretty incredible for maximizing your damage in raids. As you can see down at the bottom of the tree, she has several new tiers in the tree that have been added in patch 9.1, and of those, the left side gives you a movement speed proc, which is fine, but it's not huge. And the right side gives you a very nice reactive self-heal. which really works well for tanks. On top of that, getting another Finesse Conduit is actually better for Bear Druid most of the time than getting a third Endurance Conduit. And the final trait just adds more stat budget and more healing. Now let's move on to Conduits. For Potency Conduits, you have two really good options. Conflux of Elements is an extremely strong choice and a must-have for Druids, really of every spec. If you're playing Night Fae, it just makes Convoke much stronger. Unchecked Aggression is the other great conduit available to Bear Druids. It's extremely strong, and it adds a lot of haste during Berserk and Incarnation. It's your best potency conduit for Mythic Plus, and it's the one that adds the most defensive value. Savage Combatant is another conduit available to Bear Druids. It's really bad. I don't even think I'm going to put it on the screen. No, it sucks. Patch 9.1 has added Adaptive Armor Fragment to all tank specs, and it's fine. A big primary stat proc is pretty nice for tanks who don't have two good potency conduits, like Warrior. But for Bears, it's not likely to be competitive under any normal circumstances, and there's, you know, I guess there's a chance you could use it in raids for max DPS while Catweaving, but I think the burst value of Unchecked Aggression would still wind up being better. And certainly would be better for Mythic Plus and for defenses. For other Covenants, their given potency conduits are also pretty good. They're not quite on the level of Conflux of Elements, but they're pretty good. Endurance conduits are simple, and again, there's two clear favorites here. Well-Honed Instincts grants an excellent reactive self-heal on a decent cooldown. The nerf to it this patch has cut into its value somewhat, and you can kind of blame balanced Druids for that. I don't think that if that had just been available to Bears, they would have nerfed it. But hey, it is what it is. And what it is a really good defensive lifeline, and the other options available just don't provide the degree of defense that you need that it does when you need it. Tough as Bark is the other really good endurance conduit available to Druids. It reduces Barkskin's cooldown by a decent amount, and it stacks with Survival of the Fittest in the talent tree to push that cooldown even lower. You can really get Barkskin uptime to be pretty decent at higher ranks. We're talking like, you know, a third of the time. That's pretty nice. And when combined with the Barkskin Legendary, this becomes an extremely tanky setup that's really good at mitigating not just physical damage, but magic damage as well. Patch 9.1 has also added the Condensed Animosphere, which is bad. It gives a very tiny reactive self-heal when you take damage on a 10-second cooldown. Despite the Wowhead tooltip here, the in-game value at the time I tested it was 0.35% of max health, which would make this worth like 30 health a second, maybe. Awful. The other endurance conduits are good but not great, and I don't think I would recommend them most of the time. If you wind up getting a third endurance conduit instead of a second finesse conduit, go for them, but I would say the second finesse conduit is better. And on that note, these are the two. Born of the Wilds is a direct throughput increase due to how incredible Heart of the Wild is as an offensive cooldown. Now, it doesn't quite make Heart of the Wild line up with Convoke at the current patch 9.0 ranks, but it will get a lot closer at higher ranks. As you level up with your Covenant slots will eventually become empowered one by one. This will happen in patch 9.1, to be clear. Which basically, that just causes the Covenants in that slot to gain 2 levels. If you empower a Finesse Conduit slot and put a Mythic Sanctum of Domination Born of the Wilds into that slot, you actually do wind up with a 4-minute cooldown on Heart of the Wild. So I think for people who are serious raiders or whatever, that's not something you'll get during progression, but during farm, you will be able to have basically have Heart of the Wild be up for every other Convoke without any sort of waiting or downtime. And that'll be real nice for parsing. It should also be good for pushing really high level Mythic Plus as the season progresses. And lastly, Front of the Pack is not always as valuable as the rest of these options, but for the times where you need to add some movement speed to your raid or group, More range and more time on it is a really nice buff. Okay, next up is Legendaries, and there's a lot to talk about here. First off, the Domination Socket system being introduced in this patch adds special pieces of gear that occupy head, shoulders, and chest slots. And the other 2 slots depend on your armor type's BOE drops from the raid. For leather wearers, that's gloves and boots, which means that you're going to have to remake any legendaries that fit into the head, shoulders, chest, gloves, or boot slots if you want your gear to be competitive. Unfortunately for Druids, that's like 4 legendaries, just as Bear. Because I play both Feral and Balance as well, and have made legendaries, multiple legendaries for both of those specs, I have to remake 7. It sucks. It sucks so much. Okay, let's get to the gear. Ursoc's Fury Remembered is the most popular legendary for Bear Druids, and it's the clear best choice for Mythic Plus. You will want to make this legendary as pants, which it's the one piece of legendary gear that I'm not going to have to recraft in this patch. And there's something nice about that. It adds a lot of AoE DPS, it adds shielding that penetrates through healing effects like Necrotic, and it's very fun to play with. I had over 80 stacks of Necrotic in a Mythic Plus earlier before I wrote this, and I was at 100% health the whole time. I think I forgot to record it though. Shame. It's a great legendary for AoE fights and raids where you still need some defensive power as well. If you're only going to make one Bear legendary, this is it. But if you're wanting to take Bear seriously, you're going to need to make at least 4 legendaries. Sorry. The best purely defensive legendary for Bear Druids is the Natural Order's Will. You'll want to wear these in the wrist slot. It buffs Barkskin's damage reduction by an extra 10%, and it makes using Barkskin also cast Frenzied Regen and Iron Fur both when you cast it and when it falls off. With new high item level conduits and the right talent setup, you can bring Barkskin's cooldown down into the 30-second range. That's insanely strong. It's a terrific defensive bonus that is really, really good for Bear Druids in cutting-edge Mythic Parade progression, particularly when there are predictable burst damage moments in single target. Phase 3 of Mythic Sire Denathrius, I think, is a perfect example. The only real downside to this is that it doesn't add any damage, which is a pretty significant drop-off from some of your other options. I mean, you might be losing 500 or 1,000 DPS to use this legendary. I don't like that. That makes it less useful than Ursoc's Fury Remembered in Mythic Plus, but in raids, it's pretty nice. I think you can make a good case that Ursoc's Fury is a better defensive legendary all around when you're AoE tanking, even if you're getting absolutely smashed, because it provides constant value rather than just big individual bursts of defense followed by periods where it's not doing anything. But that being said, I will go ahead and predict that this legendary will be pretty good against a certain Banshee Queen at the end of an upcoming raid, just like it was against Denathrius. Draft of Deep Focus is the #1 single target DPS option. Wear it on the next slot. This legendary synergizes extremely well with Catweaving, but it only works when you're in pure single target. It's by far the best option for maximizing your damage on single target or mostly single target fights when you're in raids though. Next up is Lufa Infused Embrace, and you'll want to wear these as a cloak. This is the other Thrash legendary. This is the best AoE DPS option for raids. They don't have much value defensively, just 2% more damage reduction thanks to Rend and Tear. I would say these are only worth using in raids for max damage parsing, but I mean, you can do a lot of damage with these, so if you're feeling serious, go for it. So just to recap, for Mythic Plus, you use Ursoc's Fury Remembered, and for raiding, you can use Barkskin Legendary for defense, Draft of Deep Focus for single target DPS, Ursoc's Fury for a tanky AoE damage setup, or Lufa Infused Embrace for a DPS first AoE build. And just for the sake of completion, I will mention that patch 9.1 added new Covenant-specific legendaries for each class. All of the Druid ones have, I guess, some kind of appeal, but I'll be honest, I don't think that a single one of them is useful as a bear, to the point that I don't even think they're worth my time to like take screenshots of and put up on the screen. You can look at them, don't use them, let's move on. And let's get to talents. This is a setup I would run for Mythic Plus. Bear Druid has a lot of talent swaps, so let me go over them as quickly as I can. In the first tier, Brambles, Blood Frenzy, and even Bristling Fur can all be useful in different situations. Brambles is the best for DPS, Blood Frenzy is the best rage generator in AoE, and Bristling Fur is the best rage generator in single target. Because Bristling Fur is on the GCD, I really don't like it, but I guess you can cast it on the pole or before taunt swaps to help offset that cost. It's the one talent in the tree that I really never use. Basically, I run Brambles in raids and Blood Frenzy in Mythic Plus. In the second tier, all three options again have value. I've been trying to get used to just using Renewal lately, since you often don't need Wild Charge, and an extra 30% instant heal on a 90-second cooldown is extremely nice. But having Wild Charge is really good. It's sort of like a security blanket, and it's hard to be without. Your mileage will vary. Also in raids, there are some mechanics where the tank needs to quickly run out to not blow up the raid, and Tire Dash can be good for those, although Night Phase Soul Shape usually gets the job done. In the next tier, all three of the affinities have merit. Balance is arguably my favorite in terms of the passive value. Having more melee range is just really nice. Big, long bear arms. But all the passives are great. Ultimately, this tier comes down to what kind of content you're doing. If you're worried about not being able to shift out of bear form and live, then Resto Affinity is the safe choice. It can be helpful in Mythic Plus if you're dealing with a really nasty affix combo like Grievous and, well, anything else. Or if you're under-geared. For raiding, since Sanctum of Domination is filled with taunt swap fights, there's tons and tons of opportunities for Bear Druids to shift into Cat or Moonkin form and add a lot of damage, and for that it's basically just a binary choice. Is it AoE? Go Moonkin form. Is it single target? Go Cat form. It's kind of just that simple. In the fourth tier, I almost always run Heart of the Wild. If you're Resto Affinity, then, you know, I guess Sun King's Salvation was a great place to be Resto Affinity in Heart of the Wild, but there's not really a fight like that in the upcoming raid. So in that situation, you can pretty much just go Mighty Bash to help with CC in Mythic Plus, or Mass Entanglement in Mythic Plus if you're doing, say, a Spiteful Affix week, being able to lock down enemies like really, really hard with the Restos, Gore Fiend's Grasp, whatever it is, Bear Fiend's Grasp, and Mass Entanglement's really nice. It's also good for the Fox ads on Mistcaller and Mists of Ternasith. It is a big DPS loss to not run Heart of the Wild if you're playing Balance or Feral Affinity, though. So only do it if you absolutely need to. In Tier 5, Soul of the Forest is not good. That is actually one of the handful of never-used talents in the tree. Galactic Guardian is the best sustained DPS choice for raids, and it does help a lot with rage generation, which kind of makes up for using Brambles in raids. Incarnation is a good burst DPS and defensive cooldown. It's arguably the best defensive cooldown in the entire game when you combine it with Ursoc's Fury Remembered. It's amazing for Mythic Plus, but generally a lot weaker choice in raids. If you absolutely need the extra defensive cooldown, you know, the extra health that it gives and the extra duration it gives over the baseline Berserk, then it's an option. But I would say in raids you lose more than you get by giving up the rage generation from Galactic Guardian. Earthwarden is generally the best talent in this tier. It's a must-have in Mythic Plus, and it's usually the right choice in raids. It really, really increases the defensive value that you get out of Ursoc's Fury, and obviously the combination of Ursoc's Fury, Earthwarden, and Incarnation altogether is just, I mean, that's why that's such an incredibly powerful defensive cooldown. It's basically like giving Bear Druids block, like a Pally or a Warrior. The ideal use case for it would be like 2 or more mobs stacked together, but you're only tanking one of them so that you can consistently be generating stacks faster than you're losing them. You know, you don't often have a lot of control over that, but for the situations where you do, that's pretty awesome. For raid bosses who have a lot of spell damage or who don't auto attack very hard, like Sylvanas, that has a lot of spell damage, survival of the fittest winds up being a very strong defensive option, especially since you probably be running the Barkskin Legendary on a fight that really does a lot of spell damage and doesn't do a lot of auto attack damage. And then also factored in with the fact that you're going to be running Barkskin's Conduit full time, you know, that brings you down into the 35 second or so range on the cooldown of Barkskin. Pretty good uptime. Both of these talents are really good options. It's just about customizing your damage reduction to account for the kind of damage the bosses you're tanking do and what's most dangerous. And in the last tier, Rend and Tear still reigns supreme. It's by far the most consistent option and nearly always worth using. Pulverize is a really good defensive cooldown option if you absolutely need it. It's basically an extra shield wall on a 45 second cooldown. It's extremely strong as a defensive skill in raids. I think every single top level Bear Druid used Pulverize for the first Sire Denathrius kill, just to put it into that context. And I would suspect that it'll get used a lot to score first Sylvanas kills. But for anything outside of that, I think it's probably better to just have the constant damage reduction and damage increase of Rend and Tear. So just to recap, I would say there's one really good all-purpose Mythic Plus talent tree, but you can move things around as you see fit, and for rating, it's a bit more of a case-by-case approach, changing from Feral to Balance Affinity based on whether the fight you're doing is single target or AoE, and potentially using Renewal or Tiger Dash, and potentially Survival of the Fittest. There's not a ton to say about the Bear Druid rotation. You want to use your major cooldowns as much as you can, but that just means Heart of the Wild Convoke when that combo's available and it makes sense to do it. Don't do it at the end of a Mythic Plus pull. Don't, do use it when Bloodlust is going off on a raid boss. Or, you're on the burn phase of the first boss in Mists of Tir Nassif. In Mythic Plus, Incarnation is a huge defensive cooldown that is terrific to pop at the start of a big, dangerous pack, like the first platform in the other side on a fortified week, or, pretty much anytime you're doing 2 or 3 packs at once. Now, as for using Ironfur, you pretty much just want to maintain stacks whenever you're actively tanking. If you have a big burst of physical damage going to come in, that's predictable, you want to try to get 2 or 3 stacks of Ironfur up to mitigate it. And be aggressive with your Barkskin and Survival Instincts and use Frenzied Regen to get your health pool back up after you've gotten chunked down. Now, I've talked a lot about Cat form and Moonkin form and Catweaving and Owlweaving, but I haven't really given any instructions on how to do it. And I think that's worthy of an entire video, really, but I think I'd like to at least do a brief section on it. I think we should start with Owlweaving because it's a much simpler concept. Owlweaving is basically just shifting into Moonkin form to use Sunfire, cast Star Surge, and Convoke. In cases when I'm not tanking, such as in raids or, again, the first boss in Mist's stunned burn phase, I will stay in Moonkin form a little bit if I have Heart of the Wild up and Bloodlust, so that I can just keep casting Wrath or Starfall depending on what eclipse I'm in. I would say I generally don't use Moonkin form much in Mythic Plus. Basically, I will Typhoon and run away, use Heart of the Wild if it's available to automatically shift me into Moonkin form, cast Star Surge and Sunfire and Convoke, and then shift back into Bear form and keep on tanking. The main thing is that you just don't want to be tanking if you're not in Bear form, as you'll probably get killed if it's reasonably difficult content. That should be obvious, right? Keeping Sunfire up while you're in AoE, if you're able to manage it, can add a little bit of DPS, and you should do it whenever you can without tanking in Moon form, but, be smart about it. Now let's move on to Catweaving, which is something you should only ever do in raids and while the other tank has threat. Basically, the main goal of Catweaving is to maintain Rake and Rip as much as you can, and again, to convoke while in cat form and while you're not tanking. If you can, you'll want to Heart of the Wild either on the pull or immediately after a taunt swap so that you can spend as much time as possible weaving into cat form and taking advantage of the damage and combo point bonus it provides. Dambo. If your co-tank is taking the boss first on the pull, then you should start in stealth so that you can rake for the extra damage bonus, and not refresh that rake until it has completely fallen off so that you're not overriding that extra damage. Your ideal opener would look like this: Heart of the Wild, Prowl, Rake, Agility Potion, Shred to 5 combo points, Rip, Convoke, Bite, then continue the rotation from there. As for the main rotation, you want to Rake whenever it's not up, use Shred to generate combo points if Rake is up, and you won't lose uptime on it, and spend combo points on Rip primarily. If you can afford to Ferocious Bite without losing Rip uptime, go for it, but that's typically rare outside of Heart of the Wild and Convoke. One very important final note. It's called Catweaving because you weave in and out of cat form. You shouldn't just be staying in cat form even while you're not tanking. You want to shift into cat form, put your bleeds on, burn all your energy out, then shift back into bear form and maintain Thrash, Moonfire, and Mangle. Then shift back into cat form, do your cat stuff, shift back into bear form, do bear stuff, and so on. Just sitting in cat form as a Guardian Druid when you spend all your energy is inefficient, and the point isn't just to do damage in cat form only. It's to do as much damage as you can by maximizing the value of both cat and bear forms. It may seem complicated because it is complicated, but it's really not that tough. It's basically just 3 dots. 2 cat dots and then Moonfire. I guess Thrash also, 4 dots. You're mainly just keeping cat dots up on a single target and otherwise doing your normal bear form gameplay. Let's move on to stats. Something a lot simpler. Bears are an interesting class in terms of their stat budget because it does vary with talents somewhat, but generally all the secondary stats are pretty close in value offensively. Versatility winds up generally being the safest and best all-around stat, and it should be your highest priority for rating in Mythic Plus. Haste is also a good all-around stat, and having a lot of it feels really nice, but it's a little less direct in terms of adding defensive value than versatility or even mastery are. Crit gains a lot of damage value if you're Catweaving and in Heart of the Wild, but otherwise it's just a slightly above average offensive stat and a good but unreliable, so not good defensive stat. And mastery is very simple. It's very good defensively. It gives you extra health and extra healing intake. That's great. But it is kind of behind the rest of the pack offensively. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are item level and sockets, then versatility. In terms of notable pieces of gear, most of it's pretty interchangeable. You'll want to put Lightless Force as your weapon enchant for most content, although if you're purely doing single target and you're really trying to maximize your damage there, Sinful Revelation will be better. Now, I haven't touched on the Sanctum of Domination socket system at all in either of the other videos because that system is still pretty unknown. We've been able to test it a little bit on the PTR, but the info about it and just, I don't know, it just still seems very much under development even as we are a day and a half away from the patch being released. I mean, technically it won't come along until the raid is released, which is a couple weeks out, but still, at this point it looks like Blood is the go-to set for tanks, but I would say that's not 100%. Anyway, let's move on to something that is more certain: Trinkets. There are some decent ones from dungeons and raids, and I'll just highlight the best options. Phial of Putrefaction from Plaguefall is a simple single target DPS increase from Mythic Plus that's totally passive and Actually kind of bad in Mythic Plus because it doesn't work very well in AoE, but it's very nice in raids. Inscrutable Quantum Device from the other side isn't amazing, but it can be a really good stat boost for big pulls, and its 3-minute cooldown lines up perfectly with Incarnation and Berserk. It's a good Mythic Plus trinket. The best defensive trinket from Mythic Plus is Blood Spattered Scale, which is also from the other side. It's an excellent defensive trinket that still offers a decent chunk of damage output. None of the trinkets from Tazavesh, the new mega dungeon, are all that impressive, but Solea's Secret Technique is a pretty good secondary stat buff trinket. The best offensive trinkets from Castle Nathria are Dreadfire Vessel from Sire Denathrius and Hateful Chain from Sludge Fist. Stone Legion Heraldry from the Stone Legion Generals is an excellent defensive option and actually pretty good offensively as well. And Splintered Heart of Alar from Sun King is an okay cheat death trinket. Most of the new trinkets from the Sanctum of Domination raid are not that interesting design-wise, although I'm sure they'll be worth using just in terms of tuning. But there are a couple I want to point out as being interesting enough. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis from the 9 is a decent defensive boost, and it seems like it could do a pretty good burst of AoE damage in Mythic Plus or in a situation where you're tanking a lot of small adds. Decanter of Endless Howling from Soul Render Dormazane is very good on paper, and it just got a buff, but I found its proc chance during testing to be surprisingly low, like lower than it's supposed to be. So I would say buyer beware. Reactive Defensive Matrix from Guardian of the First Ones is an okay design. Being able to reflect damage is nice, but I think you need to be constantly tanking to really get good value out of it. And again, I found its proc rate to be kind of underwhelming. Since Sanctum of Domination's fights are all pretty much all taunt swap fights, you're only going to get about half value or half uptime on anything that requires you to be hit for it to function. So I would say this seems kind of bad in this upcoming raid. Maybe not on Sylvanas, and, in Mythic Plus, maybe it will be better than it looks like it'll be for most of the raid. Weave of Warped Fates is a weird cheat death trinket that gives you some control over when you decide to revive back to life, but, you'll still be missing all your buffs. You're still not going to have threat in a Mythic Plus, or in Raid for that matter, so I really don't like it all that much. Tormented Rack Fragment and Relic of the Frozen Waste will probably wind up being the two trinkets that agility tanks just use the most. More than any of the trinkets I've already mentioned, just simply because they're good old, boring, regular, direct damage trinkets. There's not really anything interesting going on there, but, damage is damage, and that's good. Finally, I'll touch on one more special piece of gear. Jotengare, Destiny's Call, a polearm that drops off of the 9. The third boss in Sanctum of Domination. It's a weird weapon because it doesn't have any secondary stats. Ideally, the way you'll want to use this weapon is you'll equip it prior to using Incarnation, use it and Incarnation together, spam Thrash for 30 seconds, then swap back to an equal item level weapon that actually has secondary stats on it. Weapon swapping is annoying, but honestly, this has potential to really up your burst damage while tanking in AoE by quite a bit. I can't say I'm thrilled about it. It seems like an annoying thing to be forced into doing, but, you gotta do it. Patch 9.1 is coming, and it should be a lot of fun. Bear Druid is really fun and powerful and versatile, and I'm a huge fan of the way they play right now. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Bear Druids and Shadowlands Patch 9.1, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye.